What's up, guys? It's Bo here again, and I'm filming in the dark, and it's not kind of turning out as workable as I thought it'd be. If you watched any of my previous like 1 or 2 entries, I basically had to resort to my impromptu light source here because it got too dark, and I kind of liked the effect a bit. So I thought I'd go with this because I knew that today, by the time I got to actually recording, I knew that it would be kind of dark already. So I thought I'd go with it, but like just looking at the screen now, I'm not sure how kind of watchable this will be. You can at least kind of semi see my face, so I guess it's not too bad. Like at least, yeah. I don't know. I tried this I think last year, and like it wasn't a good idea then, so I don't know why it'd be a good idea now. But there you go. I decided to do an entry, and guess I'll go through with it. So in this entry, I wanted to well, proceed along the lines that I've been going in the past few entries, right? So this kind of latest string of entries that I've been doing started off with me doing a video about trusting experience, right? And just as a quick recap, I've kind of given a quick recap in each kind of subsequent video, but we live in an unprecedented society, and yet most of us find ourselves miserable, right? You know, I don't want to sound judgmental, but like, I mean, I don't think it's very difficult to kind of, you know, to kind of see that, right? And so, you know, one of the major things that I teach is tapping into your sensitivity, right? And the reason I teach that is, like I've mentioned in previous videos, is because we all find ourselves in kind of this emotional dark age, which is a term that Teal Swan coined. Yeah, just the light might go off. I have to like keep turning it back on, but and so you know, most of us kind of are insensitive to energy. We're insensitive to our feelings, and so that very thing that kind of guides us towards a life of happiness and fulfillment is the very thing that we have become so insensitive to. There you go. In today's society, right? And so that's why I teach that, and kind of that involves one of two things: kind of following your joy, and also going in the direction of your pain, which is, you know, something else that I've talked about. So it's kind of twofold. But ultimately, you know, many of us who are on this journey of self-actualization, you know, to kind of come out of this emotional dark age, to come out of this darkness, this unconsciousness, you know, we kind of go on these spiritual quests, which kind of unveil all manner of like amazing kind of insight to us, right? But as we go on these amazing journeys, we realize that perhaps certain aspects of our lives aren't really changing, right? And so this kind of begs more kind of introspection, right? And eventually you kind of hit a point where like you're like, well, okay, you know, does focusing positively necessarily mean that I'm free from pain and negative emotion and despair, you know, things like that? And the more that you kind of bump up against this, the more you realize that, well, not really, because we're all part of this human journey, right? We are spirits, you could say, undergoing the human experience, undergoing physicality, but at the same time, that does not exempt us from that, right? So like the knowledge is, the spiritual knowledge is that we are spirit. We are part of this greater whole that is experiencing the individual perspective amongst the many, right? But at the same time, we are human, right? This means that everything that you feel, everything that you think, right, everything that you sense is real, right? And you hit up against this, and basically the kind of the wisdom that sprouts forth from this is that experience is God, right? Experience is God, trust in it, right? Because a lot of spiritual practice nowadays, you know, which, you know, the old term for this was religion, but I think, I don't know, religion is still kind of very much a mainstream like cultural thing. There's still a lot of religion in the world, but in terms of spirituality, which is really what religion is, like religion is kind of a subset of spirituality. Um, you know, it wi- what a lot of spirituality does is that we have all of these amazing insights, as I said, and advice and knowledge and wisdom that tells us how to live life and how to approach life, and what we should and shouldn't do, morality and things like that. But with so many ideas, right, it's very easy to miss that which is unraveling before us, right, which is life, which is experience, right. And so to live a fulfilling life, to live a life that has been well lived, you could say, you have to connect with experience. You have to be present with with reality as it unravels around you, like your own reality, and not constantly be like kind of pushing reality away from you, thinking that you've like somehow transcended reality. Whenever you get into that space where you're like, aha, like I'm above it now, and this is kind of just a guideline, but like whenever you find yourself kind of like, well, this isn't necessarily the case, but I was going to say that whenever you find yourself kind of thinking that you've got reality sussed, I guess you could say, then that's kind of like a preemptive indication that that you're sort of disconnecting from experience, right? And then what typically comes after this, and almost always comes after this, well, pretty much always comes after this, is that we then hit a brick wall. Life comes and smacks you in the face and reminds you that no matter what you think about life, no matter what you logically know, whatever you logically understand, life is still life, and anything that is part of life can happen to you, right? Because we're part of this physical experience, right? And this happens to me, this happens to everyone, this happens to the most enlightened spiritual teachers, because they too are undergoing this this life journey, right? A lot of these really kind of enlightened, high vibrational beings, right, that you see, well, that you hear about, they're kind of their kind of connection with life is such that it kind of emanates outwards, like they're kind of like transcendent in a way, right, of life. And this transcendence comes about from an unconditional kind of acceptance of life, like really kind of just trusting in life and just being like, okay, we go up, we go down, that's life, right? And so it's not transcendence in the sense of the mental kind of definition, I guess you could say, of transcendence, because transcendence implies that you have eradicated the ups and downs, right? But it's not about the eradication of those ups and downs, because that's impossible, right? As long as you're a human, as long as you're physically incarnate, you will always go through those ups and downs, right? It's part of the physical experience, right? And so you don't actually you don't transcend it in that sense. You transcend it in the sense of you accept it, and therefore it becomes something of kind of like it becomes something more divine. It's kind of difficult to explain. It's just you either kind of like roll with it, basically. You roll with it and you kind of trust yourself and trust your desires and go in that direction, but also just understand that the highs, the ups and downs are there, and you basically instead of the normal way of doing it, which is like to kind of like fight against yourself, basically. So essentially that's what it is. Like you're either because when you're trying to resist a part of reality, or like, something you think that something, this is another one of Teal Swan's things, like you think that something shouldn't be happening which is happening, or you think that something that isn't happening should be happening, right? So you're resisting what is happening, what is real, what you're experiencing in the moment. That just means that you're fighting yourself, right? And so your kind of interpretation of life is going to be very negative, right? Whereas if you just internalize it, and then and this is the thing, right? Again, I mentioned in that entry that experience is God. Essentially, experience is God, but that also makes it the ultimate teaching, but it also makes it like the most difficult thing to teach, if not something that's it is impossible to teach experience, because you can't teach anyone experience, right? And life is about going through the experience, right? So there are teachers, and we are grateful for them. I myself, I guess, am one of them. And I have many teachers myself, but be grateful for the teacher, but know that the teacher cannot teach you the journey, right? And that is both what is fucking the most frustrating thing ever, right? Ever, but also the most beautiful thing ever, right? It is this thing that is yours. You go through it, right? Doesn't matter where you are compared to someone else. You're going through this journey, right? But anyway, that was kind of like my intro. It was a bit long, but actually what I wanted to talk about in this entry, getting to what I actually wanted to talk about now, after that long intro, is kind of another part of, it's something that I've mentioned before, right? And actually, the title of this video is going to be a knockoff, basically. Or you could, I guess, you could view it as kind of, what's the word? An homage, a homage towards Teal Swan, right? This is actually she has a video that's entitled this. Contradictory Complimentaries is what she titled the video. And I want to kind of include that in this title, right? Because I want to talk about it, right? But in my own kind of capacity. So, we live in a world that, I've mentioned this before, that is kind of full of differing perspectives, right? And this is kind of the nature of reality, right? There is one perspective, and then there is the, I guess you could say, opposite perspective, right? There is polarity in terms of, there is polarity. So, one person can be, so for example, imagine kind of one person punching another person, just a random example. You have the perspective of the person who is doing the punching, and then you have the perspective of the person who is doing the being hit, being punched, right? And so, those two perspectives exist at this. They both exist, right? But it's just a matter of perspective, right? And this is essentially something that applies to our own perspective, right? Because we, as human beings, we have an individual perspective, right? Versus other people, right? Other people have their own individual perspective, right? And so, before you kind of zoom out, you kind of drop down in magnification and kind of zoom out to the bigger picture and develop your perspective. You aren't able to kind of see the significance of this, right? And this is kind of what's key behind things like empathy, understanding where someone else is coming from. I did another video entitled "The King and the Student," right, where I talk about basically, you kind of go through most of your early life thinking that you're one way. You have a set identity, but then when you start to undergo this journey of kind of developing your perspective and your awareness, self-actualization, and all of that good stuff, and you kind of develop you develop your perspective, and you develop a flexible identity in terms of you are able to kind of disidentify with the identity that you've always had and kind of look a bit broader, or like, you know, look at other people's perspectives or other things' perspectives, then basically you may get to a point where there is a kind of role of reversal, if you will, you know. So like if you're someone who, for example, is overly nice, you know, supplicating, passive, right? It may shock the crap out of you one day when you actually become the person who needs to be domineering, or who is domineering, who has like the power, you know, in the relationship between you and another person, right? And this is kind of a mind fuck, right? But like this, so and this is basically something that will awaken you to the idea of differing perspectives, right? So you will get to see basically firsthand what it's like to be someone who is passive, for example. Like you've been passive your whole life, but then you will then be able to see, and whether or not you kind of accept that experience, you know, that perspective, you'll be able to then have first-hand experience of what it's like to be the opposite, right? You'll be able to have first-hand experience of like someone who is domineering, who is dominant, who gets their way, who actually, you know, gets inundated by other people's like requests, because that's one thing you don't realize when you're like a passive, like overly nice kind of a person, right? You don't realize the pressure it is. You don't realize the kind of opposition that you get from like from people like yourself when you're in the shoes of someone who is like, you know, more kind of taking a leadership role, that kind of thing. Yes, they come perks with it, like they get their way, but at the same time, they're on the receiving end of all these like passive aggressive like fucking things from other people. People like disagree with them. People like hold them responsible like more than themselves or other people, you know. And so like you kind of develop this perspective, and you start to see that there is one perspective and then there's the opposite perspective, right? And so this is one manifestation of what is meant by contradictory complimentaries, right? What this means is that there are multiple levels of existence, right? You could say that reality is multidimensional, right? Depending on your kind of magnification level, depending on which perspective you take, right? So you can have like, you know, the individual perspective. You can have the perspective of, you know, a collective or an organization. You can have the collective of an entire species. You could have this perspective of life as a whole on planet Earth. You could have the perspective of everything, right? And we call that, you know, source perspective or God perspective. You know, those are just words, but it just means like kind of being able to view everything as one kind of singular entity, like just existence as one thing, right? So that's one manifestation, and like the one that I particularly want to talk about in this entry is something that's related to, you know, the whole kind of like trusting in yourself and trusting experience, you know, trusting in God. It is that, you know, when we're trying to kind of deal with things in our lives, right, or we're trying to make decisions in our lives, we tend to kind of make decisions based on one of two perspectives, right? Or you could, yeah. So one of two kind of modalities for decision making or problem solving, right? We either go with what we should do, right, which, you know, can be advice from other people. It could be something that you have highlighted in your own life that you need to do. And the other one is that you can do something that is in alignment with your feeling, right? And the latter one tends to be the more subconscious one, right? Because the kind of you know, the paradigm of the average person, the societal like paradigm, the mainstream paradigm, is that you do things based on head-based, you know, logic decisions, right? But then if someone pisses you off, or like, you know, something happens, or like you succumb to an addiction, that's when the subconscious kind of feeling desire kicks in, right? And that's when, you know, you sabotage yourself, right? And so the point the kind of perspective I'm trying to provide is that like these two different areas, which is what you should do, which is a kind of higher paradigm, right? In terms of it's a higher perspective, versus what I guess you could say you feel like doing, or you kind of, or is more kind of, one perspective is kind of more like moral, it's more kind of big picture, right? Where it's like, okay, well, there are these problems in my life, or like I have these behavioral problems or whatever it is, right? And you kind of, and you kind of think, okay, I need to change this. Like, it could be a habit that you have, or it could be like just like some kind of big change you're trying to make, or something like that, right? There's something that you want to achieve. There's a goal you want to achieve, right? But then there is also, so you could call this conscience, I guess you could say. Like, it's something that you should do. And then there's then there is the perspective that is more kind of personal, right? So I did say just now that, we, like, the average person's perspective is that, like, they go for like the logical thing, and then they subconsciously, do something else that is related to like their kind of survival, emotional survival. Well, actually, it kind of depends, right? Because what I'm really trying to describe is that there's one perspective that is that's kind of more big picture, right? In terms of, things like, how do I become a better person, or like, how do I solve this problem? That kind of a thinking, right? And then there's the thinking that's kind of more like what did this person say to me? Like, what should I say back to them? It's more, you could say it's more emotional. It's kind of more like down to earth, like the second one. Whereas the first one is more kind of like abstract and like moral. It's based on your kind of values, but more in a more abstract way, right? So in kind of layman speak, right, for example, right, someone pisses you off, someone triggers you emotionally, right? You can either think, okay, well, this person is pissing me off. I kind of understand myself well enough to know that I'm being triggered right now, and that what I should do in this moment is to be present with my feelings, but to be present with my feelings, but also to respect where the other person is coming from, because I understand that they have their own problems in their life, and that they aren't necessarily doing something, like, they aren't necessarily having a personal attack on me. It's just that they have their own stress, and we're all human, we're all in this together. Like, I'm not really that personally, like, I don't need to be that hurt by what she said, right? So that's the higher perspective, right? But then there is another perspective. So, like, I guess I kind of maybe, like, explained it a bit wrong. Like, the average person's perspective is more kind of down to earth, right? And that perspective is like, I'm angry, right? I'm fucking angry. Or like, no, well, that person shouldn't have said that to me. I didn't do anything wrong necessarily. Why are they shouting at me? I feel hurt, right? And again, actually, going back to that point, like, I'm not really sure. Maybe I'll kind of take that back. Like, I'm not really sure which is the more common, but like, all I'm trying to say is that there are these two perspectives, right? So, higher perspective, okay, they have their own problems, I don't have to take it so personally, I understand that, there's so many different factors in play, I don't have to take things so personally, maybe I should kind of be more understanding in the situation and be more mature and be the understanding one, But then there is your, you could say, emotional perspective as well. Like, there is your personal perspective, there is your down-to-earth perspective, which is, what they said fucking, like, hurt me, I'm really angry or upset right now, I'm triggered, right? So there are these two perspectives, right? And they generally kind of like pull you in two different directions. Where, like, that you should be mature about it. Like, that from a big picture perspective, that you should forgive the other person, that, like, they didn't really mean it, they're just having a bad time themselves, this bigger picture perspective, right? But at the same time, you're hurt emotionally, right? And so, what do you do, right? Well, that depends, right? That depends on your circumstance, right? That depends on your situation and how you are feeling specifically in that moment. And what you do in that situation really comes from, your own kind of trust in this, in your experience, right? The trust in your ability to deal with it, the trust that experience will happen in a way, it will happen, and then, you'll be fine with it in a way, right? And so, I can't really give you advice in the traditional sense of what you should do in a situation, but like all I'm doing here is just offering you that there's two perspectives, right? And that the more that you kind of do this kind of internal work, the more that you do this kind of spiritual awakening, you will realize that, there is this bigger picture perspective, but then there is also your personal perspective, right? And there is a preference between one or the other, right? There are the kind of like the more abstract, heady people. These are also spiritual people who kind of like try to be saints, right? And I did one of my videos recently was like aimed at the spiritual community. Like kind of being too kind of idealistic and abstract about things, all the time. So there's that, but there's also like the kind of more down to earth, everyday kind of a thing where it's like I'm hurt right now, Yeah, it may be true that they didn't mean it or anything, but I have to acknowledge that I'm hurt right now, right? And basically, the point of me telling you this, right? And this is also the point of if you go and watch, I'll provide a link to Teal's video about this very topic, like contradictory complimentaries. Is that like you kind of have to like hold these two perspectives in your awareness, right? Like again, we tend to focus on one or the other, but like it's good to understand that there are these two, different perspectives, and you have to honor both of them, right? You have to like, yes, you should move forwards. You should like kind of try and be as mature as possible. You should try to like honor, your kind of your ideals. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge where you are. You have to acknowledge like how you feel in this moment, right? And the more that you do this, you realize like at every juncture, like at every time you get triggered, for example, emotionally, every time like a decision comes up, there will be like kind of a tendency in you to like go one way or the other, right? And that might change actually. In my case, like sometimes I'm more kind of like abstract and like spiritual and like understanding and empathic, you could say, and where I'm like okay, I see where this person's coming from. I shouldn't be pissed off. It's not a big deal. But then sometimes when I'm in, I guess you could say like a more compromised position or whatever, I'm more triggered, then I will tend to be like, fuck that person. like, like they fucking made me angry. Fuck them. I don't give a shit if like whatever they're going through, they hurt me. So like, I shouldn't have to keep quiet about it, right? And so these two very different perspectives, these two very different approaches, right? You kind of have to like hold them both in your awareness, and and just understand, right? So I guess like practically, this means that if you're someone who tends to be kind of more, more like kind of logical, rationalizing things, but you're kind of miserable, then like you should kind of honor your feelings more, right? And not try to change your feelings necessarily, but to honor them, right? You have to acknowledge where you are, right? So like not try to like, okay, I shouldn't feel bad right now, but actually, you know what? I'm going to admit to myself that I feel bad right now, right? To be with your feelings, to consult your feelings, and just to admit you're not okay. Be okay with that you're not okay. I did a video about that also. I encourage you to check it out. And also, from the other side of the spectrum, if you're always in kind of self-survival mode, and it's always like how you feel, you might feel better, in fact, if you take a bigger perspective over what's going on, right? If you actually have a think about it and be like, okay, fair enough. Yes, like I'm fucking angry at this person, but you know what? I can tell that they're having a stressful day. I can tell that, that like they have their own problems. And so maybe I don't actually have to be that angry, and you might actually feel better because of that, right? It'll give you some perspective and some kind of emotional relief that way, right? And so, yeah, that was kind of my message. Like, there are many more kind of manifestations of this, where basically what you should do, what is the mature thing to do, the grown-up thing to do, not even that, but like just what's the right thing to do by your estimation, versus what you do based on your feeling, based on how you feel in this moment, right? You'll keep coming back to this dichotomy, right? And the more that you are aware of these two kind of things, the better you'll be able to cater for them, right? Even though they are contradictory, one's a bigger perspective where you kind of like, your problems become minute, and the other one is like your problems take priority, so they're kind of like contradictory, right? They're contrasting. Like the more that you kind of go back and forth between those two and kind of understand them both in their own capacities, then the better you'll be able to cater for them. The better you'll be able to find your rhythm, right? So and this all comes back to kind of trusting in experience, right? So, this is all about kind of like just like trusting yourself and like learning yourself and like understanding this rhythm that I'm describing here, where it's like, okay, I know my values, I know my ideals, I know like what I think is the right thing to do, but I also I'm in touch with my feelings, I'm sensitive to energy, and I honor my feelings, right? And I don't kind of like sacrifice those for my ideals, right? So cool. That was my message for this video. I hope that was helpful as always. It's something that I'm currently kind of like, everything I talk about is kind of what I'm currently going through, what I think is important. So like this is something that I'm definitely kind of is at the forefront of my exploration at the moment. So cool. It's exciting stuff, man. I love this shit. So cool. I hope that was helpful, and I will catch you in the next entry, which will probably in the dark also. So cool. I hope you're having a good day or evening or whatever, and I will catch you in the next entry. Peace out.